Hello, I'm Nick Johnson,
And I'm Katrina Anderson.
and we're here today to talk about dark patterns. Dark patterns, Katrina, this sounds very sinister. It sounds like something out of Harry Potter or Star Wars. What are we talking about here?
Well, we're not sadly talking about something out of Harry Potter or Star Wars. What we're talking about is ways to design user interfaces so that consumers are arguably manipulated into making certain choices. So it has to do with the layout and the sort of journey through the interface. So it might, for example, be making it difficult to cancel a subscription or pushing people in the direction of accepting cookies rather than declining them.
Got it. So it's sort of the design of the user interface and how that can potentially mislead people or affect people's actions. Um,
Exactly.
Got it. So let's talk about enforcement in this area, and then after that we can move on to look at some of the kind of regulatory and legislation developments. But in terms of enforcement, what have we been seeing so far?
Um, Not as much as you would think, given the amount of talk there's been about this and kind of political scrutiny of it, both at a UK and an EU level. There has been some enforcement in Norway against Amazon, and that had to do with the difficulties with cancelling Amazon Prime and a system that made that very hard. There's also been some action here in the UK by the CMA in various guises, not always referring to it as dark patterns. But there has been less enforcement than you would expect in the consumer sphere, but I know there has also been some in the data protection
That's right. I
area.
mean, this is an area where, a number of different regulators from across different disciplines seem to be kind of homing in on the same issues. And certainly in a report in 2019 from the French Data Protection Authority, the CNIL, they explicitly talk about dark patterns in the context of data protection and how they can affect the validity of consent, go to issues around fair processing, and potentially also impact on kind of disclosure requirements if you're steering people away from information that you ought to be giving to those individuals. So there's definitely a sense, I think, isn't there, that the use of this expression dark patterns is starting to proliferate more and more. What
Yes.
might previously have been called nudge techniques or
Yes.
just design
Mm.
is now falling under this heading. And I think it's a quite emotive term. It
It
does seem
is,
sinister,
yes.
doesn't it?
Yeah, no, it is. And I think the terminology is in of itself problematic because it means that techniques which perhaps in of themselves are neutral, depending on how they're used, are suddenly being caught up in, what is a very negative term. And there will be an issue that perhaps things that are done very typically by technology companies to improve user experience, to optimize a UI, maybe things like A/B testing, particularly if combined with machine learning, could suddenly have this sort of distrust by regulators because they are seen as associated with this new concept of dark patterns, which, as you say, is quite a negative term.
Yes, that machine learning point's quite interesting, isn't it? That
It is,
if you're
yes.
using AI or machine learning to help develop your user interface, and that kind of leads into the AI learning that certain kinds of ways of presenting information tend to get better results, you could see how that could start to kind of get you inadvertently into so-called
Yes,
dark patterns.
patterns. You could definitely sort of drift in that direction. And I think the risk with machine learning in particular is that you wouldn't necessarily see it. At least, hopefully, if you're doing a sort of classic A/B test, you've got a human review at each stage, which would hopefully catch it. Whereas with machine learning, there's more of a risk that it could just happen almost without you noticing.
Got it.
Um,
Yep.
but it's also difficult because dark patterns is not a well-defined concept at the moment. There's a lot of talk about it. There's a lot of things that have been thrown out of examples. But when you start to look at the legislative proposals, it becomes really clear that no one's got a firm grip on
Mm.
exactly what this thing is.
Well, let's talk about those proposals.
Hmm.
And I guess question one is, how come these proposals are being put forward? What's the gap in existing legislation that they're trying to fill?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because, of course, there is legislation. We have at an EU level the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive, which we know as the Protection from Unfair Trading Regulations in the UK. And this does deal with misleading user interfaces. And this is the basis for the enforcement that we've seen. So that there is legislation. It is being enforced, at least to some extent. But I think the reality is that there is political pressure. There is a perception now that dark patterns are rife on the internet, and there is political pressure and will to have more legislation because there's a feeling that possibly wrongly, the existing legislation isn't enough,
Mm,
and therefore we must have something new. So we're seeing proposals crop up all over the place,
mm,
in a quite a fragmented manner. So we've got it in, the UK refresh of consumer law. We've got it in the Digital Services Act, the General Product Safety Regulations. There's the proposals. There's one in the Data Act. There's some comments in the AI Act. It's kind of across the board. There's this sense of, oh, let's try and address dark patterns in this piece of
mm.
legislation.
Okay, okay. So, the legislators feeling, this is an area where we need to be seen to be doing something, but
Exactly.
sounds like there's a significant risk we could end up with kind of potentially inconsistent positions across
Yes.
different bits of legislation.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So
Yes.
so let's talk about the kinds of approach that they're taking to defining dark patterns here,
Yeah.
because there do seem to be a few different approaches here, don't there?
They do. I mean, in general, there's a bit of a theme that it always has to do with the user interface in some way, and it has to do with harm to consumers. But some of the proposals, there are kind of some additional bits to this. So, a really interesting example is the proposed amendment to the General Product Safety
Hmm.
Regulation, which actually goes down the route of saying, well, this is a form of consumer vulnerability. So it is akin to a sort of situational vulnerability like we have in existing law. And therefore, you effectively, instead of sort of creating a new test for what is a dark pattern, you're saying you look at this through the eyes of a vulnerable consumer who has been in some way influenced by the dark pattern. That's one approach. We've also seen various suggestions that actually maybe it should be about the intention of the party that builds the interface. So, maybe there's some kind of malicious or nefarious intent idea here. The other idea is that it should be neutral on that, and it should be much more like existing consumer, much more focused on the detriment, but that maybe there needs to be some kind of real impact, sort of some kind of de minimis to that. So we've got lots of ideas floating around, but I think what they all have in common is that they are going for quite a high level idea. Um, and while that does make sense in many ways from a legislative point of view, it's quite difficult to translate into the specifics. The only exception I know to this is the DSA proposals, which were put forward by the Green Party, and they've set out a list, a non-exhaustive list of examples of, for example, using colours in a way to, attract people to choose one button. Um, and at least from the point of view of applying the law, something like that is quite attractive because at least we have a list of things that we can look at and say, well, okay, this is my user face. Does it do any of these things?
Yeah, definitely. And I guess we also need to factor in that, even outside of Europe, there are other developments in other
Absolutely, yes.
territories, both on the legislation side, but also in terms of class action litigation, which we've seen in the US.
Yes.
So this definitely feels like there are lots of different kind of moving parts here.
It does, it does. And I think over the next few years, we're going to see some of those come together into some actual tangible legislation and probably guidance. Hopefully, it won't be too fragmented, but it's definitely something that needs to be on the radar as a sort of emerging legal issue, one that you might want to start talking to the business about, but also you might want to think about whether it's appropriate to get involved in consultations to try and shape a law that's a little easier to apply.
Yes, understood. And in terms of timelines, it feels like this is not an area where in Europe or the UK we're likely to see legislation this year, 2022, but
Don't
kind of
think
looking
so.
forward, we should expect to see some developments in the coming years.
Definitely. I think so. I think probably the most likely thing to get there first in Europe will probably be the DSA.
Yeah.
And that's on that sort of time horizon.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, you've mentioned a few kind of practical outtakes here in terms of, you know, getting involved in consultation processes, starting to kind of audit what the business is already doing in this area. And I guess the point that we talked about earlier in terms of machine learning is relevant here as well, in
Very
terms of,
much so.
you know, baking in some human review from this perspective alongside
Yes.
other kinds of human
Yeah.
review would be an interesting and useful thing to do. And I guess these developments also give any in-house counsel who are kind of reviewing user experience and app design and website design. Um, it gives a little bit more ammunition in those conversations with the business where you're trying to kind of persuade people to be a little bit more transparent or a bit more
Yes.
even-handed in dealing with kind of consumer design. You know, you can point to these potential developments as things coming down the track, as a, you know, another good reason for you know, for taking that more sort of consumer friendly view on things.
Yeah, no, absolutely, I agree. And I think particularly in, at least in the UK, it feels like the UK proposal is very focused on subscriptions. So if you are reviewing user interfaces in the kind of subscription area, then I would have particular eye to this, because that feels like the focus of where the UK is going right now.
Yeah, got it. Good. So dark patterns, nothing to do with Star Wars or Harry Potter, not a washing machine setting, although I guess it could be,
Could be too.
but definitely an emerging area of interest for regulators and legislators and one to keep an eye on.